Hello everyone. The title of today's talk is How to Communicate with the World. And so this is a new concept, and how I would begin to explain it for you is that you see how we communicate to people on a daily basis. We just go outside and we talk to people. And you know how we have certain thoughts about these people? Well, when you begin to see how man can communicate with his world, you need to first see how man has evolved. So it is, I find, very important for each individual to wonder about how they have come into existence. When you begin to become more existentially aware, you will see that ideas are just imagery, but on a subtler level. And that the reason we can even say we have ideas is because we are observing an objective phenomena, but we are calling it subjective. But still, the reason we're saying it's objective is because there's an individual relationship. It seems that we can think of anything, you know? And so when man thinks, he may choose to create a thinker or choose to simply be existential observance. Many human beings are learning and teaching others how to communicate with other human beings. But you need to recognize it is very important for you to, before learning how to communicate with other beings, to learn how to communicate with yourself. And this concept might seem a bit strange at first, but when you begin to see what that means when you communicate, you are putting your attention on that other person, right? Because you're communicating to someone. So when I'm saying, when you observe the self-communication that you are, it's that moment where your attention is actually less interested in how there's a sense of other and more in how there's a sense of self. When your existential view becomes one of observing the self, your interests, hobbies, and literally your programming shifts. It doesn't mean you're free from the program, but it just means you're going into a different set of imagery and vision. What that means is when you begin to see that decisions have brought you here, you wonder what decisions were, and they were just moments of imagery. And so man sees that the most profoundest thing for us to consider is not a past or a future, but how we are present here beyond our ideas. Because many beings, and not just beings, just the whole human species is thinking that knowledge is something that needs to be gained, needs to be had, needs to be contained. When I look at how many of the greatest ideas in which their pioneers were such great visionaries, but now their institutions have become a bit dull, I notice that when we begin to talk about the world, we must first be aware of who's talking. And when you begin to really deeply search for this question, it becomes your moment of being. Simple as that. There's no profound realization, there's nothing. It's just you're realizing before anything that everything that you're aware of is relevant to your moment of being. So you are finding yourself in nowhere else other than right here. And this is not a physical one, in a sense. This is you observing that all that you have been doing in your life is being here. So you have had a lot of information on how you have been here, regardless of how much you can recollect consciously, but you've gone through that experience. All you're required to do is just become aware of the life you have lived, When you become aware of the life you have lived, you begin to observe your sense of what you are considering as thought. And as you observe it, you see the silence begins breaking all your self-talk in your mind. And existential silence and stillness will find you where, in a sense, you begin to see when I'm still, I am observant of all movement. And so it seems clarity was that moment before anything was done. Trust me, for the human mystic, for the explorer, the exploring consciousness that is found in this human form at this moment, you will begin to see your exploration will lead to you understanding that you are not just an individual in your world, you are also an experience of your world. And as you become aware of it, it's as if humanity suddenly shifts from the modality of thinking that evolution was him individually progressing, rather begins to see that evolution was his whole existence shifting. Not just only the physical body. We might consider a certain change that is the human idea, which it's evolved from the ape and whatnot, and in regards to how science sees it or where science is heading. But you begin to see it's not about just the physical communication, because that which is considering the physical is of a greater state of consciousness. So what that means is when I look at that ant, I don't know if the ant knows or not, but I am a greater observance and intelligence of it right present there. And so when man begins to think what a communication with his world would be, it would be in that moment where you have observed your sense of self, how you think you're somebody here, and you have observed this body to such a depth that what you know is your being. Do you see? Knowledge, if you acknowledge this imagery, it will feel like you're going to a store to just buy stuff. You're not here to buy stuff, man. You're here to experience it. So what that means is you must assume you know nothing here, and then work with the clarity of learning from your moment of being and where that moment is going. Because there are greater dynamics and movements that can happen. What that means is when a kid, let's say it like this, let's say if humanity, the human species, was a bunch of kids who just found a soccer ball and they wanted to play, imagine one of the kids suddenly went and realized there's a field right there, just a vast field with a great place to play. And he would come to the other kids, and one of the kids who's holding the ball, so let's say the elites, or not even elites, just all those leaders who are governing people who they must lead, okay? So in other words, it's as if you begin to see what was the king or the ruler or that being on the top of some chain, you know, whether it's a chain around your neck or a fast food chain or something, you know. You kind of begin to see the consciousness of the being who is holding form is different than the consciousness of the being who is not holding form. And so guys, very quickly, I would like to share two stories with you. These stories I've said before, but I'm going to say again, because this is where they become real in regards to the context I've spoken about. So the first story in regards to the consciousness of man not holding too much imagery, in other words, you being constantly in a dynamic where the cause and effect of your reality is And so I'm going to begin with the first story, which the story is pretty much about this warlord in Zen. It's a Zen story, of course, and this warlord in ancient times, and pretty much this warlord decides to kill all the monks. As he decides to kill all the monks, suddenly at one city he goes, all the monks are running to the mountains. One monk has just stood back, you know. And so when the warlord's going to that city where the monks stood back, the general comes up to him and he's like, "Sir, we have a problem." You know, and the warlord's like, "What is it?" And he's like, "This monk's not going. We told him we're gonna kill him, but he's cool," you know. And so pretty much the warlord is surprised, and so pretty much the warlord goes to the monk. And so they're in that moment where they're standing in front of one another, and the warlord tells the monk, as if like he knows what's going to happen next, and tells the monk, "Do you know who I am? I can have my sword in your stomach in an instant," you know. And so in that moment, pretty much, that's a very huge threat, guys. And so pretty much this monk listens, and this monk is at such a state of consciousness that I'm pretty sure he did not even think. The words just manifested out of his mouth, and he said, he goes back to the general and he says, "Don't you know who I am? I can have your sword in my stomach in an instant." So what that was being suggested, that the ruler, the warlord, the individual consciousness cannot be the being who has known and understood and felt his collective consciousness. Many people believe that they've been living lifetimes, and even though that is a certain template of reality, one must recognize that if you do believe you've lived certain lifetimes, you need to see that that's been accumulating something. That every failure accumulates an awareness that could help you get faster to your goal. For blessed are those who are involved with life when life calls them. When suddenly something comes into your moment and it might not make sense, but something in you says, all right, let me see what happens. When you have one of those moments and you trust the moment of experience as a being rather than the imagery, you begin to see the intelligence of your presence is beyond form, beyond space and time. So in a sense, you see the peak of observing the self is a dissolution in thought. So your mind will become silent in existentially observing what existence is, if you are thinking about a thinker. So in a sense, guys, we need to see that all of this is suggesting how psychology dissolves and man begins to see, all right, I've made languages to communicate with my fellow man. Let me see, what have I done to communicate with my world? You know, when we begin to, we need to like begin acknowledging the world as human beings, because it seems like sometimes we're more compassionate to people we like or something than the whole species, the whole life that is around us, you know? When life is segmented, you will feel as if you need to measure how much you do something for someone. But when you don't segment your sense of space and time, you begin to see you're not even allowing a story, an elusive story to happen. So sometimes silence and stillness leads a being to a moment where he sees he does not need the segmentations of thought. And as he sees literally within you, it's like you don't have to move, you're just sitting there and you're just realizing this, you begin to see you don't have to behave in the same way as you did. Because behavior is a changing process. So agitation is simply how your moment of intelligence is choosing to, in a sense, interpret very self-observantly the manifestation and the fluctuation of this form in this life. People told me that I have birthdays, but I don't get it. Why are we just measuring one moment of change? Everything is infinitely changing within the moment. Because that's when we really understand cause and effect. In that instant of absorbing both conceptually, but also the platform of emptiness they are on. For the mystic recognizes emptiness is his guide. And so many mystics know that their first beginning teachings are ones where it's not going to be nice because the whole system wants to reset. Do you know? So it's like that moment when you ask your computer to reset and suddenly your computer's like, hey man, do you want this application to go? Do you want this personality to go? You know, and you as a being, you need to say yes. And when you say yes, you begin to see you are letting go of associations that were creating identity based on your experience of how all that you have done is within the moment. The moment with a capital M is perhaps one of the most important areas of study for man, but it is not something to give shape to. So what that means is many beings, the difference you find between a teacher with a greater self-awareness than a teacher that doesn't have that amount of self-awareness is that you begin to see how much they have an opinion. What that means is preference means there is an association with the fluctuation that is in your sense of perception, so in your senses. But when this life doesn't make sense, it seems to be the freedom, guys. Do you know? Sometimes it's as if we kind of chose a bit early that everything had to make sense or we wouldn't get it. We wouldn't know how to live. We must see that man is a natural phenomenon. What that means is when I experience or I am within a world where I have considered a sense of change of space and time, I wonder why this unique design. For there was one moment in my life, guys, where I just went into this park I would go to. This park called Edwards Gardens in Canada. And pretty much I would go to this park, and as I would go, there was this, I remember there being this huge rock. And I just go sit on this rock and this huge rock is just randomly there, but there's a small stream in front of it, you know, but also a sidewalk. So I'm sitting on this rock, and there's a sidewalk in front of me, and then there's some kind of lake, stream type of thing. And so guys, I'm sitting there, and I begin to look at some of the rocks in the stream in front of me, and I just begin to look. I just begin to look at the design, and for a moment, it's as if within my self-awareness, my ideas were wondering why they were ideas. And my perception began to, I don't want to use the word alarm, but some sense of not panic, but intense like change, just like, how would I say it? Just a very, very, it was as if a huge wind of understanding just hit me, you know? And I was just there, and it was as if I was wondering where wonder ends. And so I was looking at this world, and we are given a huge task to understand what all this individual information means in a world that is so infinite and hidden underneath emptiness. Do you know? What if our eyes are not just physical? How many libraries are we just passing by without even entering? We must begin to see that life has absolute qualities. And these absolute qualities are recognized as one, in a sense, keeps their belief from moving and then realizes that they never needed to hold a belief. That what is more critical to be aware of in this life and have your spotlight of attention on is your direct experience that takes you out of what language is suggesting you are for an individual consciousness, and you begin to see as man, as the nature of man reunites with the nature of his world, you are the world that is changing. And so we will not have insanity because we begin to see the being has potentials of simultaneous acknowledgement. It's as if we are like those people we are right now. We make fun of the tribesmen and these Amazonian people, you know, we make fun of them, but look at what we are doing. We're just calling it psyche. We're saying the mind shouldn't go beyond this limit, and what we don't know after this. We must not. I feel it's a bit kind of, you know what it is? It's like that moment where probably Christopher Columbus, let's say, was like, guys, get a boat. We're going to go check out what the world has to offer, you know? And so when Christopher Columbus was going, imagine a person there being like, no, man, why? Why are you going on a boat? There's nothing there. We see there's nothing, do you know? And so when there is an opposition to an intention to explore, that just makes the explorer know he's on the right path. Your limitations are actually your greatest guides. They are the guides for your transition of your world to then be within a new sense of self. Personalities are not stagnant. You're not just born having certain range of personalities. Personalities are all based on how you are perceiving your world and how your senses are receiving your moment. But when you become aware of the senses, you are also becoming aware of that simultaneous platform where thought is also considering the senses. And when you begin to see what thought is and when you begin to see what you are, it's as if there are many dimensions to our experience. And so it could be perhaps that me and you and all the human beings on this plane are creating the presence of a presence for a new sense of being. Do you know? As if the individuals in a world all became the thoughts within a greater mind that just took its next step, which is kind of like the transcendence of the world rather than the transcendence of the individual. And this is, of course, my views, guys. These are just my ideas. But it's very important to explore not just who these ideas come from, but also just the idea alone. What that means is someone could come and tell you something, and they might have no idea what it means, but to you it might have such profound meaning that you just wonder of the worlds ways of being. And so guys, I recognize that there was one more story I wanted to share with you. And this story is I find the message of it is a very universal one. This story is about this man named Rumi during his youth, at the age of, in his 20s, some age, where he was sitting by a fountain and he was studying and he was reading the science textbook, the newest sciences of the time, right? He was just reading something, right? And so pretty much this wild man, this dervish, this very spiritual guy who just, his name is Shams, just comes up to him, and he's much older, of course, and he goes up to this kid and tells this kid, "What are you reading?" And the kid looks at this, wild man, the spiritual wild man, and his clothes is dirty, and the guy looks old, and he says, "Nothing you would understand, old man. This is science, And then you begin to see the old man's just standing there. And so when the kid says that, the old man, in one instant, takes the book from the kid's hands and throws it in the water. And so remember, guys, back in the day, they didn't have copy machines. And so it was written with ink, so it was just like perhaps the only book that had that technology in, right? And so when the book falls in the water, this kid is shocked, and he says, "Why? Don't you know what kind of knowledge you have destroyed?" And in that moment, this spiritual wild man picks up the book from the water and brings it up, and it's completely dry, as if it was never in the water, And he gives it to Rumi, and he tells him, knowledge that can be wiped with water is no knowledge at all. And so this Rumi person gets an amazing cognition, and so there's a very great story of these two beings and the journey they go on. These are, of course, very, very profound and realized beings. And I believe they were from around perhaps 900, 800 years ago, something like that. Anyways, pretty much, guys, to connect all this, you need to recognize on some level, you need to see that knowledge is not just the immediate information you're getting, but it's also how your experience is beyond the immediate stuff you're seeing, So it's like, how do you know there's something more? Go observe that sense within you, and you'll really profoundly understand it. Now, as you go observe this, again, based on the second story, based on the first story that was shared, the one with the warlord, you begin to see you need to be aware. You need to see that it's not all about a physical focus when you recognize that there's a multidimensional aspect to you. When man creates his communication, it's as if that moment when the guy who made the dictionary was like, he felt perhaps like God. He felt like he was giving manifestation and creating worlds and whatnot. And so when man made language and he began speaking that language, it was as if we as gods were working with our creation. And similarly, just like how we see in certain scriptures, they're being suggested that man was made in the image of God, or certain sciences approaching the understanding that fractals are suggesting that experience on one level is also equal to experience on a greater level, as above, so below. And one begins to kind of notice that the intelligence must be one that the conscious experiencer must trust. So if you've opened your eyes in the morning, don't waste time. The minute you've allowed to see the world, trust it and enjoy it and learn from it and work with it. And as you trust it, you begin to see not everything that happens is based on human communication. If you think that mankind is just, affecting this world, you're wrong. We need to establish an existential sensitivity where the ideology of man is not blocking his eyes. And so that's when it's as if the way we are communicating is suggesting how we are being communicated with. And so if we are in the human being, you're not here to take the responsibility of the whole world, but you need to see that on some level you need to be responsible for your existence and aware of why you're doing certain actions. It doesn't matter if you're a saint or a sinner. It really doesn't matter. Those are just parts of the spectrum. And as one confronts this existential intelligence beyond language, there are phenomena that occur for you where you will see multidimensional travel, in a sense, as I'm saying playfully here. In other words, you being aware of simultaneous planes of reality and being the navigation was never done by an individual consciousness. It's that approach where in this consciousness technology that Mr. Within is communicating, it's as if you are being aware of what is here, and then as you observe without trying to think about anything, you know, just being. In other words, the only thing perhaps you should think about is life. Meditate on the word life. And as you begin to meditate on the word life, it's as if you're seeing what is life, what is here. And suddenly that's the meditative state where you're found in this emptiness of wonder, the emptiness of excitement, the emptiness where you were about to be surprised or gifted something. Do you see, that state is so valuable for the artists of today and the open minds of tomorrow. So in a sense, Mr. Within is suggesting that after work, when you've communicated with your fellow man, perhaps before going to sleep, before shutting down the computer, you consciously close all the applications that you've opened and become aware of them. And just sit down and just learn from the day you have lived in, you know? Learn from the living that you're doing, not the interpretation given on that living. Because honesty means a freedom of speech for your being, for your essence. Spirituality is not something where we wanted to just make artwork. Spirituality is the opening where self-awareness becomes aware of more than physicality. So your ideas begin to shake, and so do the worlds around you. And trust me, there's an understanding that one can find in this that makes you stop doing something wrong, and you correct yourself by that which you know, which Mr. Within playfully would say, that moment where you're finding Mr. Within. Now, just like how man has an opportunity to communicate, so does the greater moment. So the concept of a God is actually, I'm very surprised it stayed so long, but actually I'm surprised that it was ever thought to also be something that would go away. Conceptually, it may not be useful to how society demands us to work and how many people in society are, especially in regards to the West. But the concept of a God must be seen not as some story you're fighting against, but as that suggestion that there are greater senses of intelligence, just like how man looks at an ant, you know, what are we the ant for? And this question is one beyond form. So I'm very playfully and very mystically suggesting that as we observe something, we immediately bring that relationship in ourselves. When you look at someone, on some subtler level, there's a huge consideration of reference where you're doing between that person and you. And when you become aware of it, you see it's not about how form takes shape. What that means is some people go around the world to find certain, in a sense, initiations. But when you begin to see this life, as you wonder of what the purpose of manifestation is, you get rid of your beliefs, which usually create insecurity because you're not sure about them. If your ideology you're not sure about based on your exploration, it's as if you're not in the consciousness of the image which the imagery suggests. What that means is it is not a game. And this doesn't mean that you no longer are a player. It just means while you're playing this game of life, while you're existing in this life process, you suddenly become aware of not just the audience, not just the field, not just the soccer ball, not just the football, not just the players, other players, but for a second you become aware, gosh, I have a home outside of this stadium, you know? I have a life outside of this projection of reality which I am playing an active role in. Through many dreams, one awakens to see nothing. And what that means is that imagery will be a titan unless you see that titan was never set loose. And in a sense, your ideology never just had to be in the way you thought it was. As you understand the nature of your reality, you're no longer standing under anything, not even a spectrum that is dualistic. But the intelligence also intuitively flows based on who you are. And so there shall be no ignorance, for we are all found within the compassion of the world. We have come here to experience the passion of living. As you transcend the having to only have definitions to suggest your truth, it does not mean you are not using your rationality. It just means you are finding yourself in a very gentle moment to observe both your rationality and irrationality at the same time as they suggest one another. For once you find your world empty, you were always the fulfillment of it. Much blessings and namaste.